Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you guys here. I'm David Chan. I'm a historian of modern China in the Division of Humanities. Today is my great honor to introduce Professor Matthew Sommer of Stanford University to give his talk on the institutionalized hypocrisy of the Qing government. And let me first give a brief history of Professor Sommer. And he received his PhD from UCLA in 1994. He was a student of Philip Huang. And today he's a leading social and legal historian of China in the Qing dynasty. His research focuses on the gender, sexuality, and the family. And he used sources, original legal documents from the local and central archives in China. And here I found a very old photo of him. So this photo was taken near the Sichuan Provincial Archive at Sichuan 省档案馆, and he eats Sichuan 宜宾燃面 every day for the summer. So Yibin happens in my hometown, so we have this connection. And also, I worked as his RA when I was a MA student at Stanford, and I took his class. So today, I'm so honored to introduce my teacher. And he has published 3 books. His first book, Sex, Law, and Society in Late Imperial China, was published in 2000 by Stanford University Press. And this book has been translated into Chinese, published in Taiwan and on the mainland by Guangxi Shifan Daxue 出版社. This book has sold more than 40,000 copies. If you go to Douban, it's ranked, rated at 9.3. It's one of some of the highest rated academic books. And his second book came out 15 years after his first book. It's a monumental work of 499 pages. It took him 15 years to write. And it's Polyandry and Wife Selling in Qing Dynasty China, which won the American Society for Legal History's Peter Gonville Stein Award in 2014-15. And his latest book just came out, The Fox Spirit, Stone Maiden, and Other Transgender Histories from Late Imperial China, won the LGBTQ Plus History Association's John Boswell Prize just last year. And if you're interested in his newest book, actually he's given a book talk, not here, but at PolyU next Tuesday. So you can go to PolyU for his talk. And actually he's working on 2 other books. And so it should be his 4th and 5th book. And he has, one is Male Same-Sex Relations and Masculinity in Qing China. And the last one should be his magnum opus, Criminal Procedures in 18th Century China, the Qing Judiciary in Action. And today he's going to give us a larger overview, or something like a think piece about his view of the Qing dynasty. Okay, now let's welcome Professor Matt Sommer.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. Oops. Here, I can do it here. Sorry. The title, there it is, okay. Well, first of all, I would like to thank my hosts today, the Institute for Advanced Study and the China Global Center, and then also Professor Simpson's Center, the Humanities Institute. And also, most especially, my former student and good friend David Chang, who had a brilliant career at Stanford and then left us for UC San Diego, where he got his PhD somewhat later. I'd also like to acknowledge my own former professor, James Li Zhongqing, who is here in the audience. A great honor to me to see him after this time and to have a chance to share my thoughts in front of him. And thank all of you for coming. It's an honor to be here. I haven't been in Hong Kong since the summer of 2019, just before COVID. And the last day I was in Hong Kong on that trip was the first day of a wave of demonstrations. And my taxi from the hotel to the airport had to take a very circuitous roundabout route. So I have a lingering impression of Hong Kong on that day. And it's Wonderful to be back after 6 years and to see many old friends and have a chance to make some new friends as well. So as Professor Chang said, today I'm not really going to talk as much about my own research, although I'll draw on it a little bit. This is more of a kind of open-ended think piece, a kind of reflection on some aspects of the Qing government based on recent research that I've been teaching to my graduate students and some of my own work as well. It's sort of an overview. And much of what I say will not be terribly surprising to the Qing historians in the audience, but perhaps it hasn't been put together quite in this way for them. So I look forward to your comments and questions afterwards. So the title is The Institutionalized Hypocrisy of Qing Government. Now, I want to say at the outset that no government perfectly lives up to its claimed aspirational ideals. For any kind of political system, there's going to be a gap between its ideology and its representation of itself on the one hand and the way things work in practice on the other. This is true of any kind of government system. So in this respect, the Qing is certainly not unique. But there are some interesting aspects to this contrast or this contradiction with the Qing, which I think had important implications for the long-term fate of the Qing dynasty and perhaps of the imperial system as a whole. As we know, the dynasty collapsed in 1911, 1912, and it was not replaced by another dynasty. It was rather replaced by a republic and a series of regimes that all claimed to be a republic of one kind or another. So, the paradox of Qing government. Qing statecraft was characterized by a kind of institutionalized hypocrisy. Many aspects of Qing government have been condemned both during the dynasty and since then as irrational or corrupt. This is an especially strong stereotype in much of the historical scholarship about the Qing. For example, Qiu Tongzu's classic studies of law and of local government presume a Weberian ideal of rational government as the standard by which the Qing must be judged a failure. But the stereotype has also been promoted by Qing officials and elites themselves during the dynasty. The irony is that the very aspects of Qing government they condemned as corrupt and dysfunctional were key to how that government actually worked. So why condemn things that actually were routine and worked reasonably well over time? So to give a few examples that I'll go into more detail about in a moment, the land tax and other official revenue sources were insufficient to finance government operations, nor did the nominal salaries of officials actually cover more than a fraction of their real incomes and expenses. For this reason, Qing government at all levels, from the local yamen at the county level all the way up to the eunuchs in the palaces in Beijing, Qing government at all levels depended on informal sources of revenue, even though most of this collection of revenue technically constituted corruption, according to Qing law. In addition, the degree-holding civil service was held more or less at constant size, roughly 12,500 to 13,000, that's about the right number, even as the population tripled and the economy grew much more complex. As a result, the government increasingly depended on informal personnel employed in excess of centrally mandated quotas. And these supernumerary personnel were paid in turn out of informal revenue sources. Similarly, much of the judicial system, the legal system, was in effect outsourced to private parties who operated in a gray zone to advise both litigants and magistrates, and even to publish the Qing Code itself. And given the limited reach of the state, social order depended in practice on the extrajudicial community regulation of a very wide range of transactions and relationships, many of which were nominally prohibited. This extended, I would argue, even to the punishment of violent crimes, such as homicide, despite the imperial state's claim of a monopoly over the death penalty. Emperors and officials alike employed a pious, self-serving discourse to condemn what actually constituted routine features of the system upon which they all depended, while corruption laws were enforced only occasionally in an arbitrary way when an emperor decided to assert himself in order to intimidate his subordinates and to reassert his uniquely autocratic role in the system. But far from dysfunctional, I would argue, the Qing government actually worked quite well until the late 19th century, when, as we know, it finally faced unprecedented problems that it could not solve. So let's begin with the question of taxation. It has become fashionable to argue that the Qing state taxed at very low levels. The main piece of evidence cited to support this argument is the official land tax quota, which was fixed in the early 18th century at about 34 million taels per year. It remained fixed at that level even though the population and economy both grew dramatically over the next 2 centuries. So the result of this low and fixed tax quota is what, for example, economist Kent Dung of the LSE has called the Qing state's ultra-low tax regime. According to another friend of mine, Professor Zhang Taisu at Yale Law School, only 3 to 4% of economic output was collected in the land tax in the 18th century, and this amount declined in the 19th century. So if this picture is accurate, then there are 2 main implications of tax revenue being so low. First, you might call the negative interpretation. What was wrong with this? What was bad about it? This is Zhang Taisu's argument. It kept the state fiscally weak, especially in contrast to the major states of Europe. And this fiscal weakness may not have been apparent earlier on, but by the late 19th century, it became a big problem when the Qing dynasty was unable to accumulate the capital and marshal the resources necessary to meet new challenges. This explains, for example, China's failure to keep up with Japan in modernizing. This is Zhang Taisu's argument. So that's the kind of the negative aspect, what was wrong with this. The more positive interpretation of this low tax burden is that light taxation was beneficial for the economy and for the people's livelihood. It was a reflection of the Qing dynasty's benign, relatively liberal government. And I've heard a number of people make this kind of argument. Most recently, at a conference of the Hoover Institution, I heard several people who don't work on China say with great authority that the Qing state taxed at very low levels and so on. But personally, I'm very skeptical about this. I'm very skeptical about this argument that the tax burden was so low. Was the real tax burden really so light? How big was it, in fact? Is it even possible to tell for sure? I personally believe that these scholars have mistaken ideology for reality. Qing ideology certainly held that a benevolent emperor held taxes low in order to finance a small government made up of virtuous and thrifty officials who were paid low salaries, who were motivated by a selfless commitment to public service. This was the image promoted by the Kangxi Emperor's famous edict of 1713, the Yongbu Jiafu edict of never raising the land taxes, right? And also by his successors who piously claimed to be following example out of filial devotion, right? So that's a very important image. That's an important aspect of how the Qing dynasty tried to see itself and portray itself. But I believe that the real tax burden was actually much heavier than these official quotas would lead us to believe. But it's true that the way revenue was collected and used may paradoxically have kept the central state fiscally weak in the ways that Professor Zhang has suggested. So if we look at the real tax burden, it was a combination of official taxes, or formal revenue, made up of the land tax, the salt monopoly, the sale of offices, grain tribute, a few other things, and then unofficial revenue, made up of local surcharges and fees, occasional confiscations and voluntary donations extracted by the emperor from wealthy people, and so on. We don't know how much unofficial revenue was collected. I mean, this is the basic problem here of trying to figure out what the total tax burden really was. Zhang Taisu, in his book on this topic, estimates that perhaps unofficial revenue was equal to the official revenue. It was 100%. So official revenue, unofficial revenue, about half and half. And he considers that a generous estimate. I think that estimate is way too low. So how can we tell? I mean, I think it's probably impossible to tell for sure. I should say up front, I don't know what the real tax burden was. I don't think anybody knows. And I will go farther. I think in the Qing dynasty, nobody knew either. I don't think any Qing official knew at any given time how much revenue they were collecting in all forms. So if we look at a proxy, a partial proxy for this unofficial revenue being collected might be the unofficial or informal income of degree-holding officials. So if we look at Zhang Zhongli's classic, The Income of the Chinese Gentry, I don't know if anyone still reads that, but I love this book, and my students are still forced to read this. He makes it very clear that office holding for the Qing elite was by far the most lucrative source of income and was the path to great wealth, but such wealth did not depend on their official salaries. If we look at the income of these centrally appointed degree-holding officials, the official income, the formal income, had two parts. It had their salary, And then it also later on had the so-called Yanglianjin, the stipend. I'll talk more about that later. This was added during the Yongzheng period. But so the formal income or the official income they were supposed to receive constituted these two parts. But that's not what made them rich. Those were set very, very low, and they remained fixed and low throughout the dynasty. What made them rich was the informal income, and it was derived from a variety of informal revenue sources. In that sense, the informal income officials may serve as a kind of partial proxy for the informal revenue being collected at the local level. So, again, following Zhang Zhongli's, these are the official figures. This isn't Zhang Zhongli. These are the official figures for salaries. So, for example, we see that a district magistrate at Zhixian received the official salary of just 45 taels a year, and then the Yanglian was this much. It ranged depending on the post he had. For prefect, a little more. For financial commissioner, buzhangshi, these are very powerful officials at the provincial level who, among other things, oversaw taxation. And then a governor, this is the salary. If you look at it, if you know anything about prices in the Qing, this is pretty unrealistic for a governor. I mean, that's about the price, 150 taels of like a jiansheng degree. So this, I mean, it's a lot of money if you're a peasant. It's not a lot of money if you're relatively well off. So these are the official income or the formal income of degree-holding officials. What does Zhang Zhongli estimate their unofficial or informal income to be? Well, district magistrate, 30,000 taels. A prefect, 52,500. A financial commissioner, buzhangshi, would be between 100 and 150,000 taels. These are vast amounts of money. A governor would get 180,000 taels. Again, these are estimates, and Zhang Zhongli is quite scrupulous and conservative in coming up with these estimates. But again, if we simply compare, so compare 30,000 taels to a little under 2,000, right? You get the idea of the order of magnitude here. So overall, Zhang Zhongli estimated that the unofficial income, overall was 19 times more than the official income, for a grand total of 115 million taels annually. Well, 115 million taels, that's more than triple the annual revenue from the official land tax in the 18th century. It's more than double the total revenue from all official sources, which was roughly 50 million taels. Now, it's important to note also that Zhang Zhongli does not cover all officials in the Qing government. He covers about 23,000 Han Chinese officials, but he leaves out some 4,000 non-Han officials. If we calculate them at the same rate, that would add at least another 20 million taels to the total. So it's clear that this informal income is paid for out of informal revenue. It's clear that the informal revenue is much, much, much larger than the official revenue, right, from official sources. And saying it's 50-50 is not nearly enough to account for this sort of thing. So again, where did all that money come from? It came from informal revenue, especially the customary fees and surcharges collected at the local level. It's also important to bear in mind that officials' informal income would account for only part of the informal revenue being collected, because that revenue also had to pay for government operations, especially at the provincial level. It's possible that the informal revenue, the informal income of officials stayed the same. Since the numbers of these degree-holding officials stayed the same, it's possible that the informal income of theirs stayed roughly the same. But the problem is, we know that government operations increased because the population increased, the economy increased in size, and so on. And therefore, it was the non-degree-holding officials whose informal income would have increased as well. So this informal revenue was covering incomes of officials, but it was also covering government operations at the provincial level. By the mid-19th century, most costs were probably being covered this way. So the official land tax quota may have remained fixed, but that does not mean the amount of revenue actually being collected stagnated in the same way, as the scholars I mentioned before have tended to assume. As government operations expanded along with population economy, the amount of informal revenue must have increased as well to finance government operations. Everyone understood this was happening. Everyone understood that this is how it worked. But the details of what was going on at the local level, how much money and so on, I think that would have been invisible to anyone in the upper ranks who was trying to oversee the scene as a whole. And this is part of the problem. This is why what Zhang Taisu says about the fiscal weakness of central government may well be correct, Because even though all this revenue is being collected at the local level, nobody in Beijing has any idea exactly how much it is, and they can't get their hands on it. It's not being passed all the way up to the top, right? So if we segue to the issue of corruption, that's obviously closely related to this question of informal income. If we think for a moment about Baogong, I'm sure you all know about Baogong. He's the avatar, the prototype of the heroic Qing or incorruptible official, right? And this figure is a hero of opera, of popular fiction, of folklore. Baogong himself was a Song Dynasty magistrate who later was deified, became a kind of god of justice. He's closely associated with Guangong. And he is absolutely pure and incorrupt. So if you see the way he's portrayed in drama or in novels like Qi Xia Wu Yi, he is pure and incorrupt, and his nobility, his virtue, they are aided by heaven and by supernatural forces. As I'm sure you know, ghosts of murdered women will appear to him in a dream and beg him for justice. They will tell him clues that enable him to crack a case, this kind of thing. But if you think about it, the whole point of the Qingguan, as portrayed this way in popular folklore, fiction, and drama, is that he's the only official who's pure. All the others are corrupt. Right? That's sort of the assumption behind the way he's portrayed, right? I mean, because if they're all pure, then what is distinctive about Baogong, right? And so instead of being a typical of officialdom, he's this unique exception to the rule that they're all corrupt. So that was the popular image, right? That was the popular image of imperial government. And I think that even though it's not literally accurate, I think we have to recognize that it was related in an important way to the reality of the situation and reality of what I was talking about with informal income. Because if you look at the Qing Code, if you look at law and ideology of the Qing dynasty, the collection of informal revenue in the ways I've discussed was prohibited. And the informal income of these officials, the 19 times the official income, that was corruption. It was prohibited. It was against the law. There were dozens of statutes in the Qing Code. Statutes again, 官吏受财，有事以财请求，在官求所借贷人财物，or 检验失商不以时, and on and on and on. There are many, many, many laws against practices that were defined as corruption. And many of the practices that are defined this way were actually routine practices involving the collection of surcharges and fees and this kind of thing, the giving of gifts to superiors and so on. Corrupt acts involving as little as 80 taels could be punished by death, according to the code. And this included giving or taking bribes for a favor, influence peddling, extortion, coerced or usurious loans, unfair sales or purchasing practices, and of course the levying of unauthorized fees and surcharges. And these laws applied to officials at all levels, as well as to the yamen personnel who worked in the local yamens, the clerks and runners, the coroners, and all these other people. Now, from the standpoint, let's see here. From the standpoint of ordinary people, the kind of ordinary peasants and other people who had to pay the surcharges and customary fees at the local level, probably what counted as corrupt or as abusive was extraction at rates that exceeded what they were used to, or that violated local norms in some way, right? I mean, for them, the paying of these surcharges and fees was a sort of the normal part of doing business, an unfortunate, unpleasant aspect of real life. So what they saw as corrupt or abusive probably was if some magistrate or yamen subordinate was exceeding the local standard, right? But this pragmatic, common sense definition of corruption coexisted with the official definition that we find in the law. And according to the official definition, most informal revenue collection was prohibited, even if it did not violate local norms. So there resulted a paradoxical situation in which much of the routine working of government was, by that government's own definition, illegal and potentially liable for prosecution. But the relevant laws, the laws in the code, were enforced very capriciously at best. They were enforced only occasionally and arbitrarily. Prosecution for corruption usually seems to have targeted senior officials who were denounced by their successors in office or who otherwise attracted the malevolent attention of the emperor himself. So it tended to be the people who were closest under the emperor's eye who got singled out for very harsh treatment for this. And as I say here on the slide, since corrupt practices were universal, potentially every official was liable for prosecution, right? Everyone was corrupt, right? Even if prosecution was an unusual and extraordinary event. So there are various scenarios that are relevant here. So for example, it was necessary for officials to make gifts, expensive gifts, and cash donations to their superiors in order to facilitate their careers, to avoid trouble. And for higher-ranking officials, receiving these gifts and donations and so on were a routine part of their informal income. This is one of the ways that revenue sort of trickled upwards, you might say, from the grassroots. And for senior officials, the kinds of gifts and cash donations and so on that they were required to make included birthday presents for the emperor himself. This was one of the chief means by which revenue flowed all the way up to Beijing, right? And so there was a common problem that an official, say a financial commissioner, for example, might have. He would develop a budget deficit, maybe through no fault of his own. But then if he was going to be leaving his post, he knew that his successor coming in would discover this deficit, and in order to cover his own ass, would impeach the guy who's leaving his post, right? So you have to scramble to raise money to make up this deficit before you leave, otherwise you're going to be in trouble. Right. This happened many, many times. It was a very, very common situation. So how do you make up the deficit before you leave? Well, you solicit voluntary donations from all your subordinates throughout the province or the prefecture or whatever. Right. So you get all of the, if you're the judicial commissioner, you ask all of the county magistrates to donate, I don't know, 1,000 taels each or whatever it is. And, you know, given their informal income, that's probably within their means. Right. This was basically routine, these kinds of financial networks. Right. So they had to do this because if a deficit was left unresolved, your successor would probably report it. It would impeach you in order to avoid being held responsible himself. Now, as I mentioned, despite the nominal harshness and rigidity of the law, corruption was prosecuted relatively rarely. And many of those who were impeached for corruption, who were found to have practiced corruption, were not actually punished, or at least not punished very severely. It seems from the cases that we have, and Nancy Park and Ma Qihua and others have done very interesting research about this, it seems that the prosecution that did take place was highly political and seemingly quite arbitrary. I say it was political, but the fact is, usually it's impossible to tell why any particular official was singled out for prosecution, because what they were being prosecuted for doesn't seem to be different from what anyone else was probably doing. And so we don't know, in most cases, why someone was actually prosecuted, even though, of course, they were prosecuted for corruption. And so, you know, what we need to ask is, in any given case when someone's prosecuted, what was the real reason they were prosecuted? Right? I mean, you could prosecute anyone for corruption. So what was the real reason this individual was singled out, right, when everyone else is doing the same thing? And a corollary, of course, is why was this kind of corruption, quote unquote, prohibited in the first place? What purpose was served, whose interests were served by the prohibition and the occasional spectacular punishment of what was clearly routine, normal behavior. So if we look at a couple of cases, these have been studied by Nancy Park, a friend of mine, very good legal historian. These both are from the reign of the Qianlong Emperor, 18th century, and these are kind of instructive examples. I think they're kind of typical of the actual prosecutions that took place. So the 1757 case of Jiangzhou, he was the Buzhengshe, the financial commissioner of Shanxi. He was promoted to be governor of Shandong, and so he knew he was leaving his post. And this is the scenario I mentioned a moment ago. After he left Shanxi, his successor impeached him for leaving a deficit of 20,000 taels and then having extorted money from his subordinates to make up the deficit. Right? So the deficit actually had been made up, but when he left and went to his new position in Shandong, his successor, the new financial commissioner, found out what had happened and sent an impeachment memorial. And again, as one might expect, when Jiang Zhou in Shanxi learned he was going to be promoted, that's good news, but then he quickly realized that his successor would find out about the deficit. So he requested donations from every magistrate and prefect in his province, and then he also borrowed money from other people. All of this was illegal under the corruption laws. He used some of this money to pay for the deficit. He cleared the deficit, but then he used the rest of the money to give presents to his superiors who'd recommended him to be promoted to Shandong. Right? Again, this is normal practice. Now, he would have avoided discovery if he had not been impeached by a successor, and so we have to wonder, did the successor for some reason really have it in for this guy? We don't know. And his successor in his memorial says, quote, "I cannot help trembling at the thought of these horrors," this corruption, right? So the Qianlong emperor gets this impeachment. He appoints a Qinchai Dachun to investigate the case. And again, the appointment of a Qinchai Dachun, an imperial commissioner, this was an extraordinary move. It signaled that the emperor had decided to make an example of Jiang Zhou. Right? And in the end, Jiang was sentenced to immediate beheading, 斩立决, which was one of the more severe death penalties you could get. Two subordinates who had assisted him in his extortion were also sentenced to death. Several other officials were exiled or had their careers otherwise ruined. Jiang Zhou's entire estate was confiscated, Chaojia, the famous Chaojia that happened to Cao Xueqin's family. Right? And the balance that was left after the deficit was cleared was taken by the Neiwu Fu for the emperor's personal use. And the emperor, Qianlong emperor, expressed his horror at this case. And I read this. "Jiang Zhou's corruption truly is beyond comprehension. It is more than I can believe. How can I trust and use officials if they are this corrupt? From my father's time until now, the administration has been pure. Who would have thought that such an affair could occur?" Now, I think this is completely disingenuous. Right? This is a kind of posturing, right? It's kind of performative rhetoric, because I'm sure the emperor was well aware that what Jiang Zhou had done was quite normal behavior, right? As did the person who impeached him, and everybody who was involved in the investigation. But they all have this amazing rhetoric about how shocked and horrified they are, gambling in Casablanca, right? In fact, the informal funding network that was exposed by the case of Jiang Zhou, the soliciting donations from subordinates in order to clear a deficit, this seems to have been nothing unusual at all. Subordinate officials were expected to make donations. They were expected to give gifts to their superiors because their performance reviews depended on their superiors, as did their hopes of promotion. Even the amount of the deficit, 20,000 taels, it doesn't seem like that much money, given that the real annual income of a district magistrate is estimated at more than 30,000 taels. The informal income of a financial commissioner like Jiang Zhou himself is more than 100,000 taels. In fact, Jiang Zhou probably could have cleared the deficit using his own money if he wanted to. But I think what this shows us is that the usual practice for handling a deficit like this was to collect a little bit from everyone, and then you clear the deficit. That was just the way you handled these things. It was routine, instead of using your own money. Right? And presumably most of those lower officials could afford the relatively small sums that were requested from them. So the outcome of this case also highlights a feature common to high-level corruption prosecutions. The emperor personally profits from the chaojia, right? You inventory the estate, and then you confiscate the whole thing, and then it ends up in the pocket of the emperor. There are also situations where the emperor will punish someone by demanding a voluntary donation of some vast amount of money, right? And so in these cases that are ostensibly about extortion from subordinates, the emperor appears as the chief extortionist, perhaps the most corrupt in the empire, one could argue. So the basic technique you see in this case for proving corruption is you do an inventory of the entire estate of the person who's accused, and if the value of the estate exceeds what they could reasonably be expected to possess based on their official income, then they must have gotten it via corruption. But again, given the huge discrepancy between official and real income, probably any official in the empire could have been proven corrupt if they inventoried their estate. Right? So this was available to use against anyone in the degree-holding civil service, I would argue. If we look at the second case, this is another financial commissioner, this time Yunnan, a guy named Qian Du. He was interrogated under torture. He was sentenced to immediate beheading. More than 20 other people were sentenced. Hundreds of people were interrogated. So this is a big case, a big case. Qian Du's corruption was exposed when a district magistrate was impeached for fiscal mismanagement. The magistrate had run up a shortfall of several thousand taels. But in his defense, this magistrate claimed that his own superiors and their private secretaries and staff had extorted some thousands of taels from him. So he had run up this shortfall by trying to get money to pay them. And this had led the deficit. And the biggest debts he had incurred were for expensive gifts and large sums of money given to Qiandu and his family members and his employees. Right? So in response, the provincial governor impeached Qiandu. The Qianlong emperor again ordered an extraordinary investigation. This revealed that Qiandu had a personal fortune worth more than 90,000 taels. And the emperor concluded that this was obvious proof of corruption, because how could he possibly have 90,000 taels given his official salary? Now, we should note that a financial commissioner received an official salary of just 130 taels. His Yanlian stipend was about 8,000 taels, hence the emperor's conclusion. But according to Zhang Zhongli's calculations, the informal income of a financial commissioner would have been in the range of 105 to 150,000. And given those figures, a personal fortune of 90,000 doesn't actually seem all that big, right? You sort of wonder, what did he do with all the rest of the money? What's interesting, though, is that halfway through this investigation, the emperor suddenly ordered that the case be stopped, that it be transferred to Beijing so that he could supervise it personally. And then he ordered it quickly wrapped up, and it led to the death penalty for Qiandu and all these other penalties. And the reason he did this, he claimed, was that the provincial investigators were focusing on irrelevant issues, in particular the issue of imperial tribute, in other words, presents for the emperor on his birthday and other occasions. And it turned out that one of the main drivers of extortion in the case of Qiandu was the expectation that Qiandu and other senior officials give the emperor extremely expensive gifts made of gold and jewels. In effect, Qiandu and his cronies had been compelled to extort from their subordinates in order to pay for the lavish gifts that they, in turn, were compelled to give to the emperor. And so the emperor became very defensive once this came out in testimony, claiming that he never kept such gifts for his own use. He gave them away. He did not really expect valuable items as presents. He only wanted some local herbs and tea from the region. And the implication that his own extortionate demands may have been a chief driver of corruption made him very angry. And the three top officials managing the investigation were forced to submit elaborate, groveling self-criticisms. And they also, in penance for their errors, they assessed themselves fines ranging from 5,000 to 30,000 taels, all of which went directly into the emperor's pocket. But what's interesting is that the emperor's protests notwithstanding, there are many examples of the Qianlong emperor himself complaining in private about how he had received these gifts that were cheap and vulgar and really kind of crappy, and he demanded more and better and more expensive ones. He was especially taken with European-style jeweled clocks. And if you look at the palace collection in Taipei, there are a whole bunch of these things. And this is an edict to a governor who had given him a clock that he really liked. So this governor, I guess, was fortunate. The gold-plated clock tower decorated with Western scenes is truly great. From now on, if you find any others as attractive as this one, buy a few more. If you find any that are even bigger and better, buy some of those too. Don't spare any expense. Now, where does the emperor think the money comes from for this kind of thing? I mean, he was not a fool. Whatever else you say about the Qianlong emperor, he wasn't stupid, right? So this is kind of an instructive example, I think. Again, it's important to emphasize we don't know the real reason why Jiangzhou and Qiandu were singled out for such harsh treatment, including death. We don't know why. There seems nothing particularly unusual about their financial activities. The sums they extorted from subordinates seem to have been well within the means of officials of their rank, and it's not clear they were even perceived as extortion by all the people involved. The sanctimony, the horror expressed by the investigators at this corruption seems completely disingenuous, as do the expressions of outrage by the Qianlong emperor. This was a kind of highly performative virtue signaling, and everyone involved knew it, I'm sure, right? This is a prime example of the contradiction between discourse and practice in Qing statecraft that I was talking about when I talk about the institutionalized hypocrisy of the Qing government. There's a pretense here that corruption, quote unquote, is a shocking aberration, a shocking exception to the norm, when in fact, by the official standard, everyone was corrupt, arguably even the emperor himself. But of course, the vast majority of officials who engaged in such behavior never got in any trouble at all. And also, for every case of harsh prosecution, there are many more examples of officials being impeached for corruption who were not punished at all, or who got off with a slap on the wrist, suggesting that they were on better terms with the emperor. So for a couple examples of this kind of capricious prosecution, there's a 1780 example of the Governor General of Yungui. He was convicted of extorting 50,000 taels from his subordinates. All he got was a reprimand. He didn't even have to pay back the money. The emperor just scolded him, and he said he was sorry, he wouldn't do it again, and that was it. And we should note that a governor general's informal income was about 180,000 taels a year, right? So he just got a reprimand. In 1793, there was a case of the Lianghuai salt commissioner Quan De, and the salt monopoly was notorious for lots and lots of extra revenue being collected. This man, Quan De, he accepted more than 190,000 taels in bribes from salt merchants. He was ordered to pay a fine of 384,000 taels, spread out over 5 years, to the emperor's personal treasury. Now, this is interesting, because if the problem is that his income exceeded his official salary, and that counted as corruption, and he was being punished for corruption, then how on earth was he supposed to be expected to pay a fine of that size? Right? I mean, this shows a very cynical emperor who obviously knows that this guy can afford that much money, right? And so it shows that we really shouldn't take at face value any of the rhetoric about corruption, right? But all he got is a big fine, but that's all he got. That was the only punishment. And this really exposes, I think, the cynicism and hypocrisy of this basic technique of using the estate inventory to prove corruption, right? What if they did a chaojia on this guy? God knows how much they would have found, right? But of course, the most notorious and famous example was the Qianlong Emperor's own favorite, He Shan. I'm sure you've all heard of He Shan, one of the great villains of the Qing dynasty, right? He Shan's meteoric rise from the rank of an ordinary palace guard to grand counselor at a very young age has never been clearly explained. But after the Qianlong Emperor died, his son, the Jiaqing Emperor, who did not like He Shan, ordered He Shan arrested for corruption, and He Shan was forced to commit suicide. He Shan's estate was inventoried for confiscation. It was valued at the equivalent of 15 years' worth of central government revenue, which is kind of an unbelievable sum. And now this is an extreme case, right? This is the most notorious case, but it illustrates 2 points. First of all, He Shan's notorious conduct was tolerated for decades, as long as he enjoyed the special favor of an emperor. The second point is that in the end, he lost everything, including his life, and his vast wealth ended up in the pocket of another emperor, right? So we see that one of the features of this kind of capricious prosecution was the personal profiting of the emperor himself, right? Now, these high-profile corruption cases highlight the routine nature of the practices so labeled, as well as the emperor's own chief role as extortionist. His demands for tribute helped fuel his subordinates' behavior. Moreover, a common outcome was for the emperor to reap enormous profits. So, here's He Shan, looking happy while it lasted. So what is the logic of this? I mean, if this kind of financial behavior was pervasive and routine, why was it prohibited in the first place? What purpose was served? Whose interests were served by enforcing that prohibition so arbitrarily? So that most people got away with corruption, but every once in a while, someone was singled out for a spectacular punishment. Arbitrary prosecution was, above all, an expression of autocratic power. And here, of course, it's useful to recall Philip Kuhn's argument in his famous book, Soul Stealers, that political crime, such as heterodoxy, or I would argue corruption, provided an opportunity for the emperor to exercise his uniquely arbitrary form of power. His power, which he holds uniquely, stands in contrast with the kind of routine, rule-bound power of the bureaucracy, of the degree-holding civil service. So in theory, of course, the emperor is all-powerful, but in reality, he can do nothing by himself. He receives all of his information from his ministers. He must enact all of his policies through his ministers. So the risk is that the bureaucracy will swamp him with routine and paperwork, in effect bending the emperor to their will, so that he loses all agency and initiative. So faced with this situation, what was an emperor to do? By definition, the emperor was above the law. The emperor, and through him his ancestors, were the source of all law. And the whole point of the autocrat's arbitrary power was that it was arbitrary, right? It could be wielded at whim without any need for the emperor to justify himself. If all officials were corrupt, then anyone could be targeted at any time. And so they all knew that the only thing protecting them was the emperor's forbearance. They lived at his pleasure. As officials, they enjoyed lavish wealth, high status, and great power. But if they offended the emperor in some way, or if he simply woke up one day and he felt tired of being taken for granted by his ministers, and he decided to make an example of somebody in order to shake them out of their complacency, then they could lose everything in an instant. It could all be taken away. Their lives, they could be stripped of offices and titles, interrogated under torture, put to death. Their estates could be confiscated, their families ruined and impoverished. It was all possible. And they could not protest their innocence because it was a foregone conclusion that they were all guilty, right? They were all guilty. So this, from a certain point of view, was a very useful device to hold in reserve and then to use once in a while to whip people out of their complacency and to remind everyone who was boss. So again, from this standpoint, the purpose of prohibiting routine universal practices as corruption while withholding prosecution most of the time, it was like placing a light pressure on the jugular vein, right? Just to remind them. And then every once in a while, someone would actually get strangled or have his throat cut, just to remind everyone else of their place. From this standpoint, capricious, arbitrary enforcement of the law was a feature, not a bug. Right? Also, I think one can speculate, given the huge sums that emperors pocketed, the timing of corruption prosecution might have been partly determined by cash flow. Right? I mean, if an emperor stood to profit 100,000 taels every time this happened, maybe he consulted with the Neiwu Fu and they decided they're running a little short, so okay, I'll prosecute someone. It's impossible to know for sure, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility. Okay, so if we turn our scope downward a bit from the top, the senior officials who were prosecuted in this manner, so far we've been discussing guan, right, the officials who were appointed by the imperial center, most of them. So here we see a magistrate holding court, and then we see all of the personnel who helped him do his job, the runners and clerks and so on. So the degree-holding officials, the guan, were appointed by the imperial center. Most of them held degrees, either won via exams or, as Professor Lawrence John can tell us, purchased, or both. They could not serve in their home provinces or within a certain distance of home. They were regularly rotated through the Huibi system. And the degree-holding civil service remained fixed in size, along with the quotas of higher examination degrees, just like the official land tax quota remained fixed in size. So, for example, there were roughly 1,400 to 1,500 district magistrates at any time during the entire Qing. So this was the case even as the pool of educated literati taking civil service examinations increased along with the population. In addition, of course, there was the far larger number of staff who worked for officials in their yamens. These are the clerks, the runners, the police, the jailers, and so on. These men were hired locally, and they stayed on while the officials came and went through rotation. Now, given population growth, the increase in socioeconomic complexity, the size of government had to increase because its responsibilities, its operations had to increase. And it did indeed increase, but it was the local staff that increased, not the degree-holding civil service. Every government yamen had centrally mandated quotas that limited the number of clerks and runners that could be hired in each locale, but these had been fixed early in the dynasty at unrealistically low levels. So in practice, local yamens would hire as many people as they needed, and these supernumerary staff, the ones hired in excess of quotas, in some cases the actual number of staff might exceed by 10 times or more the number of officially authorized and budget for. So these people were all paid for out of unofficial revenue, right? Just like the unofficial income of the degree-holding officials. These supernumerary staff were also paid through unofficial revenue. And the hiring of supernumerary personnel that was financed via unofficial revenue, this was seen at all levels of the Qing government, including even the eunuchs in the imperial palaces in Beijing, as Norman Kutcher has documented. And again, like corruption, quote unquote, this entire system was unauthorized. It technically violated the mandates of the imperial center. But in reality, this is how the Qing Empire worked, and everyone knew it. Now, one of the interesting things about the yamen staff, the Xu the clerks and runners, is that they played a critical role in how the government worked. Their numbers steadily increased. but they were scapegoated. A constant feature of elite discourse and official discourse was the claim that these people were inherently corrupt, incorrigibly evil. Yamen clerks and runners were responsible for all the bad things in government, for extorting bribes, for extorting excessive fees, for making false arrests, for inflicting illegal punishments on people, for terrorizing the common people, for provoking disputes in order to profit by litigation, and so on and so forth. And yet we have to ask, if Yamen clerks and runners were so terrible, why did the Qing dynasty preserve this system intact over 250 years? Why didn't they get rid of it and do something else? Right? Why didn't they reform the system in some way, come up with something better? Given that these personnel were indispensable to the way government worked, historian Bradley Reed has flipped the script by problematizing the discourse itself, the discourse of vituperation, the scapegoating. He asks, what was the purpose of this discourse saying that these people were all inherently bad, all inherently corrupt? Whose interests were served by it? His study of the Ba County Yamen in Sichuan shows that the Yamen staff were actually governed by a coherent body of customary rules and norms. They were written down, they were submitted to magistrates for approval. Magistrates would cite these written norms and rules to judge disputes between the staff. And the Yamen staff appealed to the same Confucian standards of upright conduct and public service that supposedly animated the degree-holding officials. An earlier generation of historians, like Qiu Tongzu, accepted this discourse at face value because their work relied uncritically on magistrates' own writings. But as Reed points out, by scapegoating the Yamen staff, degree-holding officials could distance themselves from the unpleasant but necessary aspects of government. Serving warrants, making arrests, managing lawsuits, inflicting punishments, and most important, of course, collecting taxes, including all of those customary fees and surcharges that comprise the informal revenue of the government. And we have to ask, if clerks and runners were corrupt for relying on fees and surcharges, what about the magistrate himself, who got the lion's share of that money, right? His 30,000 taels of informal income, right? Who actually was corrupt, right, in this system? So again, here we have this, between this discourse and the reality, we have another prime example of the kind of contradiction that I'm talking about today. So again, there are a number of implications here. As unofficial personnel increased over time, so did the need for unofficial revenue to pay for them. In other words, the real tax burden. The ultimate source of nearly all this revenue was agriculture. Ordinary people paid the various informal taxes. That money trickled up. Given that the hiring of personnel and revenue collection largely proceeded off the books, there was probably nobody in the Qing government at any given time who could tell how much revenue the state, broadly defined, was actually collecting. They only knew what came into the central treasury in Beijing, but that would have been a declining fraction of the total, right? Over time, real decision-making power gradually shifted from the center in Beijing to the provinces, and from the degree-holding officials appointed by the center based on Confucian credentials to the unofficial local personnel, whose numbers were actually growing and who did the practical work of government. At the same time, as the dynasty went on, the imperial center gradually lost touch with local realities. So this was true throughout China proper, but the situation was even more extreme in regions that had especially high rates of population growth. So there were the internal frontiers, we might call them, places like Sichuan that were depopulated during the Ming-Qing transition. In those places, the land tax quota had been set very low in the early Qing to help them recovery, but it was never raised. There were also new frontiers linked to China proper via imperial expansion, such as Manchuria, Inner Mongolia, Taiwan, the Southwest. These served as safety valves for overpopulation in the old core regions. In Ba County, the population more than quadrupled over the 19th century, approaching 1 million by the end of the dynasty. And the local yamen there hired thousands of extra personnel locally and never reported the numbers to the imperial center. And all those people were paid for by informal revenue because the official land tax quota constituted a tiny percentage of what they were actually collecting. So I think it's possible that the Qing actually had the worst of both worlds. If we return to the low taxation thesis that I began with, If the key issue is the central government's ability to concentrate resources, to deploy them for strategic purposes, then the informal nature of the fiscal system kept most of that revenue out of the central treasury, and this situation became more extreme over time. So in that sense, Professor Zhang Taisu is probably right that the taxation system made for a fiscally weak central government that could not marshal the resources necessary to meet the challenges of the 19th century. But in fact, the real tax burden on the people may have been very heavy all the same. It's just that money was never in the hands of the central government. So you had the worst of both, a heavy real tax burden on the people plus fiscal weakness at the center. I think that's probably a more realistic sense of the situation. If we turn to the legal system, do I still have some time, David? I'm okay? All right. If we turn to the legal system, I think an important feature of this was a kind of outsourcing of critical functions to private parties of different kinds. The typical magistrate had no expertise in law. His education focused on the classics, but he was responsible for maintaining law and order, arresting and judging criminals, and so on. So, of course, to function, he needed expert staff. These were the famous 行名木有, the private secretaries. He also had ones to help him with taxes, but we won't talk about them today. These people performed a vital role in the administration of justice. They typically had been trained in law by apprenticeship, often to a father or an uncle. And Professor Chen Li of the University of Toronto estimates that at any given time, there were about 3,000 of these private legal experts working in yamens around the country during the Qing. In Professor Chen's view, these men were the de facto judges in most of the courts during the Qing. They constitute kind of an empire-wide network of people with similar training, talent, and ethos. Without them, the legal system could not have functioned. In some respects, they resembled a corporate body of professionals. But it's important to note, they were not employed by the imperial state. They were not officials, they were not civil servants. They had no formal credentials or licenses. Instead, each was a personal employee as a member of the household of the magistrate he served, like a servant, paid out of the magistrate's own pocket. Their salaries came from the magistrate's informal income. In other words, this vast network of legal quasi-professionals existed outside the civil service and was entirely financed by informal revenue. So on one side, we have the private secretaries, the 行名木有. On the other side, we have the 宋师, or the 宋棍, as they're labeled pejoratively. These were also quasi-professional legal specialists. Their status was even more tenuous. They provided clients with private legal advice for money. They were basically lawyers. Most litigants were ordinary people who could not afford such services, but more substantial litigants, merchants, landlords, and so on, they would hire these 宋师 to draft their plaints, to coach their testimony, to craft their defenses if they were accused, and to concoct false evidence when need arose. There were some powerful lineages who had their own staff of 宋师 who functioned like consigliere to the mafia, assisting with vendettas and so on. All of this activity was prohibited by the legal code, and litigation masters were subject to severe penalties if they were caught. In theory, a litigant was supposed to present himself before the magistrate uncoached and to represent himself. So we have this another paradox here, that given the large and rising population, the growing size and complexity of the economy, a certain amount of litigation was inevitable. It had to be dealt with. And magistrates were ill-equipped to deal with litigation on their own, hence the vital role of their private advisors. By the same token, government operations, including law and order, required a large and growing sub-yamen staff, and without the fees from legal cases and other informal sources, their wages could not have been paid. At the same time, a growing number of sophisticated litigants were unintimidated by the local courts, and they had the resources to afford private legal advice. And this situation was growing over time. Right? That was the reality. But at the same time, you had the ideology of the Qing, in which the father, the 父母官, the father-mother official, was not a narrow specialist, a professional, or a technocrat, 君子不器. Rather, with his mastery of the Confucian classics, he operated from a deep foundation of moral knowledge that guided him as he adapted to various circumstances. By the same token, the petitioners who came before his court were simple, humble people seeking justice, like children who looked to their father to be protected. Society was harmonious because of the emperor's benevolent rule, and if litigation did occur, it was because evil yamen clerks and runners and evil 宋师 provoked it out of their selfish desire to profit from the people's difficulties. So as we see, this ideology was sustained by a series of hypocrisies. You have the denigration and scapegoating of yamen clerks and runners and of songshi, keeping the private secretaries outside the civil service, preventing them from establishing themselves as a corporate body of professionals. On the surface, it appears that litigation was an encounter between the magistrate and ordinary people in the courtroom. But this too was a sort of fiction. As Professor Chen Li has argued, much of the real action went on behind the scenes in the duel between the songshi advising the litigants and the xingmi muyo advising the magistrate. The real action was between them. And in a sense, the litigants themselves and the magistrate were like puppets on stage, performing roles. So again, from the top to bottom, the Qing system relied on informal personnel financed by informal revenue. In fact, as Professor Zhang Ting has shown, even the publication and distribution of up-to-date editions of the Qing Code, the legal code, relied on private commercial publishers because the central government didn't want to spend the resources to keep publishing and distributing copies of it. So this became privatized. So a kind of outsourcing on the cheap was a key aspect of Qing's statecraft. Now, I would argue that this extended even to law and order and how violent crime was handled. And this is, I'll talk a little bit more about this and then I will stop. I'm sure you're all tired of hearing my voice. But as Philip Huang, my own advisor, Huang Zongzhi, and others have analyzed, probably most disputes were settled through community mediation and through out-of-court settlements without recourse to formal court judgments. And this was true even when parties had filed charges in court. And Professor Huang sees this as a key part of a coherent system of justice that tied grassroots communities to the county yamen with the magistrate at its apex. You have the informal and the formal realm. They're part of a pyramid. My own research about such practices as polyandry, 招夫养夫, and wife selling has exposed another side of this informal realm of quasi-legal practice. Polyandry and wife selling were prohibited, but they were nevertheless widespread and tolerated because they provided solutions to problems that the state and its courts did not provide. When such matters did come before local courts, magistrates had little choice but to handle them flexibly and pragmatically, because in reality, they had limited ability to impose their vision of Confucian morality on the poor. But in that sense, the practices that I've looked at, polyandry and wife selling, these were part of a much broader field of practice in which transactions and relationships that were nominally prohibited would be managed and regulated by communities according to their own norms and standards. There are many other examples of this kind of thing that I could talk about. But this informal realm of customary practice functioned apart from and parallel to the more formal realm of codified law and court adjudication. And I've come to believe over time that the formal realm where the courts actually were managing law and order was much smaller than I had believed before. I can't estimate it exactly, but I think there was a huge amount of stuff that never entered the courts. And perhaps basically, the Qing state did not have the resources to micromanage society. Therefore, for a crime to be prosecuted, somebody had to care enough to report it to the authorities, which might involve considerable hassle and expense, including the need to travel to the county seat and stay there. For this reason, a great deal of what happened was never reported, let alone prosecuted, regardless of illegality. Now, the extreme example is probably homicide. And here I'm speculating, but I hope my speculations are not too unreasonable. If we look at Qing ideology and Qing law informed by that ideology, the emperor was supposed to be the giver and taker of life. He had a monopoly over the death penalty. Nobody else could take life except the emperor, in theory. Therefore, homicide was not just a terrible act in society, it was a usurpation of the imperial prerogative. Right? It had a kind of ideological implication. And homicide was usually punished with death. Qing law included no doctrine of homicide and self-defense. There were only a couple of exceptions to this. The only scenarios in which one could kill with impunity were if a husband caught his wife in the act of adultery, or if a woman was resisting rape, or if a householder confronted a nighttime intruder in his house. In those situations, you could kill with impunity. No other situations. So, one question that has arisen in scholarship is, what was the homicide rate in the Qing dynasty? I argue that it's impossible to know for sure. I don't know what it was, and I don't think anyone else can tell for sure either. But there are ways to try to estimate this, and some scholars in the past have tried. In the Qing dynasty, any major case, 重大案件, any major case that warranted the death penalty had to be reported all the way up to Beijing, ostensibly for the emperor to approve the death penalty because he had to approve the taking of life. So in Beijing, in the 中国第一历史档案馆, there is a vast number of these reports of different kinds about death penalty cases. And we can use these files to count the number of homicides that were reported in this manner, right? And if you count the number of homicides that were reported all the way to Beijing and exist in these records, you end up with a rate of roughly 0.8 to 1 per 100,000. But it's important to note that that was not the homicide rate, right? That's a subset, I would guess a very small subset of the number of homicides that actually took place. These are the homicides that were reported to the local magistrate, that were cleared when they arrested a defendant, that were successfully prosecuted and convictions were secured, and then they were reported all the way up to Beijing and they were approved in Beijing. So again, that is not the actual homicide rate. If we look at comparative homicide rates in medieval and early modern Europe, it's estimated broadly at 10 to 20 per 100,000, which is a lot. The USA today, 5.7, which is bad because we have no effective gun control, as you may have heard. This is a big problem in the United States. In India today, it's about 3 per 100,000. In the PRC today, it's claimed to be less than 1 per 100,000. So if we accepted that number as the Qing homicide rate, it would be about the same as it is in China today. Personally, I don't believe that in the Qing dynasty they were as effective at controlling social order as the PRC is today. So again, this is a subset. The clearance rate, so for example, we have homicide that takes place. Then somebody has to report it to the Yamen. That's already not going to be all of the homicides. And then the Yamen has to succeed in arresting someone, right? And that's not going to be all of the homicides reported. And then they have to secure a conviction, sends them to death, and then report all the way to Beijing where it's approved. That, again, is going to be so in each case you have a subset of the previous category, right? So these numbers are suspicious. My guess is that the actual homicide rate in the Qing was probably closer to the European rate than it is to the rate in China today. So if I'm correct about that, what are the implications for the Qing dynasty, for understanding the legal system? The Qing in the 18th and especially the 19th centuries, it was teeming with desperately poor people. There were many people who were rootless. There was intense competition for limited resources in many regions. These problems were prevalent and obvious in the 18th century. They got worse over time. The qualitative evidence in legal cases and other sources suggests that there was a lot of violence. Violence was pretty commonplace in Qing society. Men went around armed all the time. They had knives. They had a fangshan dao. It's like everybody had a knife, and those knives were used in fighting. And so my sense is that this was not like a perfectly harmonious society with a low homicide rate, but rather that a vast number of things were happening that never got reported to the system. So my conclusion is that, one, a lot of people got away with murder. Two, most homicides were probably never reported to the authorities. Instead, they were handled by communities and lineages on their own. They were outsourced, in effect, you might say. And again, there's a lot of indirect evidence from legal cases. Now, I should say up front, I'm speculating here because I don't think anyone can prove for sure one way or the other, right? But the qualitative evidence suggests to me that lineages and communities handled a lot of this on their own. So once in a while, you will see in a Xinketiban a case where a powerful lineage, they employed what they call jiafa, family law, to 处死 somebody who was really getting out of line, who had committed homicide or adultery or something like that. And the most common method that I've seen is burying people alive, which is more cruel, actually, than any penalty the Qing dynasty used. But they would bury them alive, 活埋. And I've seen many examples of this. And the reason you find out about it is that somebody who was sympathetic to the person who was killed, who was put to death, would then disobey orders and go off and report it. Or too many people knew about it, so rumors would spread and someone in the Yamen would hear about it and they would investigate. There's some indirect reason. But my guess is that for every one that the Yamen ever heard about and investigated, there are probably a whole lot of them they never did. And it's, my impression, I haven't done like a quantitative survey, but my impression is that in counties places like in the Sanyi region of Guangdong, for example, where you have very powerful lineages. The rule there is that the state is weak and the family is strong. And the magistrate may have no idea what's going on out in society unless somebody comes and tells him, right? In those regions, you get very few of these Xinketiban in Beijing compared to places where you don't have such strong family organizations. A lot of power was informally delegated to communities and to families and lineages. So what I believe is that despite the imperial state's claim of jurisdiction over homicide, and despite the imperial state's claim of a monopoly over the death penalty, in reality, probably most homicides were never reported. They were instead handled by communities on their own, and official rhetoric to the contrary, I would argue that the tenuous social equilibrium maintained during the Qing actually depended on this kind of outsourcing of law and order. It depended on this outsourcing of criminal investigation and procedure to families and communities, because an understaffed, underfunded state apparatus could not have managed this on its own. So this is the final way in which I believe there was a kind of outsourcing. So I'm sorry I've taken so long. I will just wrap this up with a couple of concluding thoughts. So we have the ideology, a picture of the Qing in which there was low taxation, which financed a small government made of thrifty, incorrupt officials who served the emperor and people out of selfless commitment to public service, and in which there was a harmonious society with a low homicide rate that enjoyed prosperity as a result of low taxation. I think the reality was quite different. Instead, you had a heavy real tax burden via informal revenue. You had the employment of huge numbers of personnel in excess quotas. You had ubiquitous financial practices that were in a gray area but were officially defined as corruption. Official service was the path to great wealth, with office holding being the most lucrative source of income for the elite, and a society with a great deal of disorder and violence in which a tenuous equilibrium was maintained by outsourcing many of the vital functions of government. So a question is, if that was the way the system worked, why prohibit all these things? Why not just, we could imagine hypothetically the Qing system could have been reorganized along very different lines. Customary fees and informal gift giving could have been eliminated. Instead, official tax quotas could have been set at a realistic level to finance government operations, to pay officials at a realistic rate so they wouldn't have had to take gifts and so on. Personnel quotas could have been set at realistic levels and allowed to grow so that necessary operations could be addressed and they would be paid for out of official revenue. You can imagine that. And so why wasn't that done? Well, the Yongjong Emperor actually did try to do it, right, at least part of it. In the 1720s, he launched an effort to formalize the informal surcharges and fees, to bring them under central oversight, under the rubric of huohao guigong, right, to collecting the meltage fees for public use. He banned all the informal surcharges, actually reiterating a ban that already existed. But he also authorized a single surcharge amounting to about 10 to 30% of the official land tax quota. This official surcharge was supposed to be used in turn to pay local magistrates bonuses that were known as this famous yang lianjin, the silver to nourish virtue. In theory, this would free magistrates from having to resort to corruption. In other words, the now prohibited informal fees and surcharges. Instead, they would give this yang lian money and they would be fine. But this effort failed. Under the Qianlong Emperor, the bonuses were scaled back, but also because those bonuses were set as a percentage of the formal tax quota, which didn't increase, they didn't increase either. So as I showed you in the numbers before, they were set at this informally low level and they stayed there. So after the Yongjong Emperor was gone, the pre-Yongjong norm quickly reasserted itself. And the situation became more elaborate and baroque as time went on. But also, we must acknowledge that for all its contradictions and hypocrisies, the Qing system worked very well for a long time, right? So why change it? It really is only from an anachronistic perspective that it seems dysfunctional. It would be a mistake to view the Qing as a failure. After all, it lasted more than 250 years. Arguably, many of its institutions lasted even longer, having been inherited and adapted from its predecessor, the Ming. The Qing was actually far more resilient than most comparable regimes when faced with the unprecedented challenges of modernity. After all, the Qing held on for 70 years after the Opium War, despite a relentless series of crises. In contrast, Japan's Tokugawa shogunate collapsed only 15 years after Matthew Perry's visit, and Matthew Perry didn't even fight a war. The Meiji Restoration was almost bloodless. The Qing also held up much better than India's Mughal Empire, which was destroyed by the British, and that led to the subjugation of all of South Asia as colonies for nearly a century. China was never colonized. When the Qing finally fell, it was followed shortly by the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Romanov empires. None of them proved any better than the Qing in their ability to meet the new challenges of the 20th century. So when we look back at this system, for all of its problems, I think we must recognize that it was very successful. So why change? It was only in the late 19th century when many wanted to change that for various reasons it became difficult or impossible to do so. All right, I've talked for too long, but I'm going to stop there. Thank you all for your patience. And also, thanks to these scholars whose work I used.
So we have at least 4 Qing historians, right? I'm sure you guys have a lot of comments, questions, and we have students studying Qing history. Okay, let's get started.
Okay, so Matt, I really enjoy your talk, and I'm thinking about like maybe you have an overall project to connect the fiscal part with the legal part, and I have a general feature of Qing. This is my reaction, like to, but in that case, I think you. A bit dangerous like, because you already have this agenda. So in some cases, you might have this selection favorable to your story.
That's very possible.
Yeah. So for the fiscal part, I think just go from your puzzles. Like it looks like highly corrupt system and it depends on everything on this illegal informal revenues. But in the meantime, seems to be quite successful in terms of maintaining governance. I mean, if we start from this puzzle. I think that the important point here is that a lot of these unofficial revenues was actually used also for the local, like public governance affairs. Yes. That part actually is quite important because that means why, as you mentioned, like why some cases are treated differently, but some cases are treated like very harshly, but some just. I think that, I'm not sure, but based on my reading about the materials, like depends on how these monies was actually used. To put
corruption cases.
To spend it on to spend on the public project in local affairs, one story. But if you put into your pocket, different story. This is just based on my reading, but this is also related to your discussion with Zhang Taisu's, like why all this surcharge was not going to the center. I think the answer, I mean, as I put it in my review of his book, is like. Everyone from the center to the local knows all these surcharges, very heavy burdens, I mean, province by province, are mostly used for local like governance to cover the in deficit, the budget from the center. And this is why like the center have no intention to bring that money to the center because it's all used for the local purposes. And then why you. So I think this use of the official money for the public purpose locally and for the private use of the officials, I think that actually seems to be quite important, the distinction for your story, yeah.
I agree with you. Maybe I didn't make myself clear, but so I cited Zhang Zhongli's figures about the informal income because there we have some measures, right? Because he was very careful and he was actually very conservative in his estimates. But we can use those as a proxy for part of the informal revenue. Right? But in fact, because that's the degree holding civil service, that may not have increased over time. What did increase over time, because informal revenue also had to finance, as you said, all the operations of local government, an increasing proportion over time. So that area was growing, right? So what we have from Zhang Zhongli is only a part of the picture, and it's an increasingly small part of the picture. But it's true. I mean, a lot of this was used. So, for example, the entire court system in Ba County was paid for from fees and surcharges charged to litigants. The entire thing was paid for. Was that corrupt? Probably most of the time the people involved didn't necessarily see it as corrupt, but the fact is it was all off the books and never reported at the top. And technically, according to the imperial rules, it was all in excess of quotas and it was all. So, I mean, now they didn't enforce these rules in Ba County, but it's a weird paradoxical situation that they would.
Yes, I agree, but a quick response, because you also mentioned this jiaodai, like the deficit in jiaodai, Qikong, right? Actually, we have tons of cases, and actually a lot of this Qikong was used for local, like public use. So this is why, like, they were not punished, but like you have to pay back all the deficit. But everyone knows what is really happening. But if you really put the Qikong into your pocket, that would be a very different story. Yeah. So. So in other words, like when you are left your positions, you don't have to cover all this deficit because everybody knows why you have this deficit. So the case you mentioned might be the first case you mentioned, right? It might be a kind of unique case, not representative of all the quick cases.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just had it was a great talk. It's so rare to see this kind of large, big picture. I had a couple of thoughts. So one was that when you start and you do the costs and then the income, you didn't actually include all the military costs. Right. But actually, you include you look at the actual cost of Qianlong's 10 great campaigns, way outweigh, if you total it up, all the civil. And then even in the civil, outside of the campaigns, it's just the normal costs, like say Liying, which actually does a lot of the policing because they're actually spread out in all kinds of very small little pockets of really almost more like police force or something. So that would just make it even more compelling as to where does the money come from. And then in terms of the capital cases, what we do have is every year we have a report of the number of executions. Right. And what's really interesting is that they're all the same. There's a quota. It's 2,000 a year. So basically, late 18th through the late 19th century, is at the end of every year of the Shilu, there's a report. On even in spite of all the cases go up, the 9 reviews and everything, and then the actual number of people who are executed, it's always 1,900 something or 2,000, but it's basically 2,000 plus or minus. And so there's some kind of also, as in China where you have this 表面 of process, there's some kind of preset out result. And then in terms of, the system where everybody's guilty, all I could think of as you were talking was, God, it's just like China today.
Well, I wasn't going to say that. I'm glad you did. I'm glad you did. I'd had that in the back of my mind.
Don't want to devolve this into just a Qing historian discussion here, but thanks for the talk. But I actually would disagree with what Wenkai just said about the bit about you get in trouble if you start putting money in your own pocket. I think you actually gave us a few examples where it's clear the officials who got in trouble, had plenty of money, right? But at the same time, from my own research and just casually encountering cases while you're reading people's biographies, clearly these guys all had tens of thousands of taels of silver sitting around just doing things. And the moment you ask them about, where did you buy this house? Where did you buy this courtyard? Where does all this land come from in your home county? You're not affording that on your official salary. They are putting money in their own pocket, and the emperors all know that, right? So there must be something extra going on in prosecution of individuals, right? The Jiang Zhou that you used as your first example, he's connected to the Jiang family I talked about in my book. His older brother, 2 years later, got appointed to be the Grand Secretary. Are those two things linked? I have no idea. Was he from a poor family? Well, I mean, technically maybe, but obviously not, because his family had already served in very high places for multiple generations by that point. So the idea that he needs to somehow scrounge around for 20,000 is fairly unconvincing on the first surface of it, right? So something else was going on. Was it to set an example so that his older brother would behave at court? Who knows? But I do wonder if I can ask a question that's much more speculative. Clearly, you're getting at a bigger project here. Why is this narrative so attractive? And it's still so attractive to the point where guys who don't work on China at Hoover, are quoting this.
You mean the low taxation one?
Yeah, the virtuous model, right? Let's call it that, right? Why is the virtuous model so attractive even to today? What's when it's so clearly, obviously, doesn't check out the moment you examine the actual evidence, right?
So I don't know, and again, I don't know why people believe the tax burden was low. I don't think we know what it was, but I don't think it was low. But that's a great question. Why is it so attractive? Because you have the other one too. If you read, Bai Hua Xiaoshuo, the government's corrupt, right? Except for the occasional Qingguan who's very unusual, right? And so in a way, I don't know. I mean, that's a puzzle. But getting to the first part of your comment, why were people singled out? Sometimes I think it really was just arbitrary. There was no reason. And again, the arbitrariness is a feature, not a bug. The whole point of arbitrary power is that it's arbitrary, right? Nobody can tell you when to do it or make you give a reason. And so I think of this example sometimes. I was involved in a search, and I'm not going to name any names or give dates because that would be revealing, but I was involved in a search at Stanford in which we came with a candidate for this position, and then the department voted unanimously in favor of this candidate, and then the ANP committee voted unanimously in favor. The deans accepted the recommendation. They forwarded the recommendation, all unanimous, and then the provost vetoed it. And Stanford being a private university, the provost, all the reason the provost had to give was that this candidate does not meet the high standard required for a position at Stanford University. It's like that was it. It's like, and for the life of us, we could not come up with a reason. And then, digging a little further, I found out that the provost for the whole university has, like 1,000 of these cases a year to deal with. So, I mean, even if they do nothing else, they have maybe 3 a day. And this is everything from the medical school to physics to Chinese literature to you name it, right? And the provost cannot be an expert on all these things. And how much time realistically can they spend on each file? You think about it, not a lot, right? I think what happens sometimes is the provost wakes up one day and says, I haven't vetoed anything for a while. They're starting to take me for granted. I'm pissed off. I have indigestion, whatever it is. And so they veto something. And everyone, okay, we have to pay attention to the provost. Now, maybe that's a cynical thing to say. I mean, I love my university, and I don't think it usually works this way. But, the provost has a lot of arbitrary power at a private university like Stanford. And what's the point of having that if you never use it? So, actually, I will name one name. Condi Rice was notorious for this kind of thing. And I think in that case it was probably a reflection of her insecurity. But I will say no more about that topic. Thank you for your questions. Thank you. Yeah,
just jumping again, I'm
of course,
sorry.
Please. Please.
Because
respond to Lawrence.
Because Lawrence said something. I just make me think about how comparatively we can put Qing into this story. Because, as I know, in the 18th century England, the officials are not supposed to live by your salary. It's not supposed to get money outside your salaries, and this seems to be universally true in that. The age of old corruption. And how that is different from Qing, I'm not sure. And in the case of Qing government trying to have this ideology about the harmony and no litigation, it's the same thing in the 17th and 18th centuries, because litigation was so expensive. Yeah. It's going to just economically ruin you. So read the Bible, be nice to your neighbor, and this is what they said to their subject, right? So in that case, how is that different from Qing? I don't know. Yeah.
Well, as I said at the outset, there's always a contradiction or a difference between reality and the kind of ideology or the tatemai, the baigajiazi. Every regime does this, right? Sometimes the contradiction may seem more extreme. I think in a way what's in the long-term significance of this is that it sets up the failure of the Qing in the late 19th century, in some respects at least. It's not the only factor. But here I might agree with Tai Su to some degree, that this is one important factor. The way this was set up, it worked very well for a long time to meet the challenges this system faced. You get to the last 50 years of the dynasty, and there are other aspects to this too. I talked about this. He's a good friend of mine, but you can't just look at the revenue collected and what Beijing had on its goal. You have to look at how they used the money they had. So, for example, if Mark Elliott is correct, right down to the end of the dynasty, they used something like 20% of their central government budget to pay for the banner system. And militarily, this was a useless institution by the time of the Great Rebellions, right? But they were paying 20% of the central government revenue on that. Well, that was because of what you might call the constitution of the dynasty, right? The role of the Manchus and the banner forces in this dynasty, and what Eliot would call ethnic sovereignty, right? And they couldn't reform that and stop making those payments without, in a sense, committing regime suicide, you might say. Or at least it wouldn't have been the Qing anymore if they'd done that. So there are aspects like that as well that I think are very important. But do we have any? Any more questions?
Let's save the last question to our students. Anyone? Yes. It's an MPhil student, Laura student.
Dear Professor, I'm a big fan, and I once emailed you to ask if I can apply to Stanford University.
You're applying to Stanford University?
No. You told me I should stay at HKUST, and
But we've emailed before.
Yeah.
Okay.
30
Nice
years
to meet
ago.
you.
Yeah, nice to meet you too. I think it's kind of abstract to see the hypocrisy of a government. But for me, the document I read, I think is very easy to encounter or to see some documents that shows that the Qing emperors and maybe many Qing officials were hypocritical. Like the Qianlong emperor, you shoot one side of Qianlong emperor, like he want to accept expensive clocks, but at the same time, when some governors want to present him some gift, like some memorial, oh my dear Lord, I want to present you a very nice suitcase and some cheap local fruits. And the Qianlong emperor may say, okay, I only accept this cheap fruit, and I don't need any expensive gift. And for some Qing officials, like maybe Wang Tonghe and Ran Yuan, after their retirement, all of them claim that they live very frugal life.
Right.
This expensive, that expensive, I'm very frugal, I don't have money. So I think you can maybe take consideration of these cases and to make your argument or
Well, there are these
argument more concrete, more.
You do see these cases in gazetteers when they have the biographies of the xianling, right, of the magistrates, and they'll talk about a magistrate who was so thrifty and frugal, and he wore rags, and his children ate nothing but millet, and when he left, he didn't even have a donkey to ride on, and the people all celebrated his great virtue and set up a stone stele. Well, I mean, the reason I think those are exaggerated, but the reason they celebrate him is that he's so different from everybody else, right? The same thing with like Hai Rui in the Ming Dynasty. I mean, Hai Rui was celebrated for his incorrupt honesty. He was a classic kind of Qingguan. It's very clear if you read the biographies and things about Hai Rui, everyone else thought he was an asshole. Excuse my language. But they thought this guy was a complete jerk because he was such a purist. He was so rigid. And he refused to go along with the way the system normally worked, and he refused to, lubricate the wheels, and he just was a pain in the neck for everybody else. And so there are these people you read about, right? These Baogongs, but I think the reason why we hear about them is that they were so unusual. They stood out against this background of this gray area, this financial system, which. Again, I mean, this is the way the system works. So is it really corrupt? Only by the official definition. So then we have to ask, well, why do they have this official definition? Well, I tried to suggest a way in which it makes sense. But I think if you were saying at the beginning that all governments are hypocritical, I completely agree with you. They all are, one way or another.
And everyone may be.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. And one small question. You said the Qing government or Qing central government gradually lost their control of local realities.
They increasingly lost touch with local reality. The center, the imperial center.
What do you mean by local? You mean?
Well, so for example, in tax collection, even collecting the official quota, clearly by the early 19th century, the way taxes were really collected is that certain key yamen runners would go out and they would negotiate with the heads of communities, and basically saying, okay, this is going to be your quota and for this year, and then they would negotiate this, and then these leaders of lineages or communities, they would go and sort out who pays what and so on. The government had no idea who's paying what or who owns what land. They're completely ignorant of that. But as long as they sort of met the negotiations and gave them what they had agreed on, then okay. And so it's a situation where basically they have lost touch with the reality of land ownership. And the whole thing depends on, in a sense, this sort of equilibrium between the yamen runners. And that's all very local knowledge, right?
Yeah, sometimes I'm curious whether you think maybe Beijing is part of the local area?
Well, it has its own locale, but
yeah.
But I'm talking about tax collection in, I don't know, Jiangxi or someplace.
Yeah,
right?
we heard a lot of famous rumors like the Daguan Emperor and the Guangxu Emperor asked some eunuchs about the price of an egg, and eunuchs said it's 5 taels. It's much more than the reality. So maybe the Qing Emperor not only lost reality from local area and even from Beijing.
It's possible. Yeah.
Maybe.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Sommer, for the stimulating talk, and thank everyone for your participation. Great. If you have more questions, you can continue to ask him after the talk. Thank you.